The weight of ownership. Sharon Matthews stood at the edge of the pool, watching as the last streaks of golden sunlight disappeared behind the treetops. The air was thick with the scent of chlorine and the faint aroma of jasmine from the garden she had planted herself. She sighed, taking a moment to appreciate the tranquility before she got back to work. Owning a luxury rental estate was far from glamorous behind the scenes. It was late evening, and while her guests were winding down with cocktails on their villa patios, Sharon was still working. She checked the PF balance, adjusted the lounge chairs, and ensured the gate was locked. It was a routine she had perfected over the years. For nearly a decade, she had poured her heart into this place, fighting for funding, battling skeptical investors, and handling everything from plumbing issues to landscaping when she couldn't afford to hire extra help. Now, her boutique rental estate was thriving. The exclusive lakeside property attracted high-end clientele who sought peace, privacy, and premium service. Sharon took pride in what she had built. This estate wasn't just a business. It was a reflection of every struggle she had overcome, every permit she had fought for, every late-night planning session, every doubt she had pushed aside. As she secured the latch on the pool gate and turned to leave, a voice sliced through the quiet evening air. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Sharon stiffened at the sharp, accusatory tone. She already knew where this was going before she even turned around. Standing at the edge of the property was a woman, probably in her mid-50s, with an air of entitlement Sharon had encountered too many times before. She had the kind of posture that screamed authority, her chin lifted just slightly, eyes narrowed as if she were solving a puzzle she didn't quite understand. Sharon had seen this expression before, and it never led to anything good. "I'm closing up the pool," Sharon said evenly, keeping her voice calm. The woman's eyes raked over her, suspicion evident in her gaze. "You work here?" Sharon studied her for a beat. She knew exactly what this woman was implying. People like her always asked questions, not because they wanted answers, but because they had already decided what the answers were. "I own this property." The woman blinked. Once. Twice. Then scoffed. "Oh, really?" Her voice was dripping with disbelief. "That's interesting, because I happen to know the owner." Sharon tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "Do you?" "Yes," the woman said firmly, taking the step forward. "This is a high-end rental property. I don't think the owner would be okay with some random person locking things up." Sharon exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. She had spent years perfecting this, swallowing the anger, pushing back against the frustration. "I am the owner. My name is Sharon Matthews. I bought this estate in 2014. But the woman wasn't listening. She was already reaching for her phone. "You need to leave," she snapped. "I'm calling the police." Sharon let out a humorless chuckle. "You're calling the police? On me? On my own property?" The woman's lips curled into a smug smile. "Exactly. If you really own this place, then you won't mind proving it to the officers when they get here." And just like that, she pressed the call button. Sharon crossed her arms, watching as the woman paced a few steps away, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I need officers at the Lakeview estate. There's someone trespassing at the pool. She's locking it up like she owns the place." Her voice was theatrical, dripping with false urgency. Sharon could hear the muffled response from the dispatcher. "No, I don't know her name," the woman admitted. "But she's here, and she refuses to leave." Sharon rolled her shoulders back, letting out a slow breath. She had dealt with people like this before, people who questioned, assumed, and policed without reason. But this was something else. The woman turned back to her, eyes gleaming with misplaced confidence. "The police are on their way," she announced. "I'd suggest you stay put." Sharon raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, the woman hesitated, as if thrown off by Sharon's lack of fear. "Good," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Because when they get here, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." Sharon glanced toward the row of luxury villas. A few guests were outside on their patios, sipping wine, enjoying the evening. Some had turned their heads toward the commotion, their curiosity piqued. Sharon turned back to the woman, her gaze unwavering. "Let me get this straight," she said, voice calm but firm. "You saw me, a black woman, closing a pool, and instead of asking the single follow-up question, you just assumed I didn't belong." The woman's mouth twisted. "Oh, don't pull the race card." Sharon smirked. "I don't have to pull anything. You did that all on your own." The woman's face darkened. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I know this property is owned by someone else. I've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years. I know who comes and goes." Sharon let out a soft laugh. "Oh, then what's my name?" The woman faltered. "What?" "My name," Sharon repeated. "If you know the owner, then you should know my name." The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Sharon took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You don't, do you? Because you don't know the owner. You just assumed that someone like me couldn't be." The woman bristled. "You're twisting my words." Sharon shook her head. "No, I'm laying them out exactly as you said them." The woman glanced toward the road, shifting uncomfortably on her feet. Maybe she was realizing she had made a mistake. Maybe not. But before she could say anything else, the distant wail of sirens shattered the evening air. Sharon exhaled slowly, bracing herself. This was about to get interesting. The arrival of authority. The rhythmic wail of sirens cut through the stillness of the evening, sending a ripple of unease through the luxurious estate. The flashing blue and red lights flickered across the pristine waters of the pool, casting distorted reflections that shimmered against the tiles. Sharon Matthews stood still, hands at her sides, her heartbeat steady despite the tension in the air. The woman, who had yet to introduce herself, straightened as the patrol cars pulled up near the entrance, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. She had summoned the law, her personal reinforcement, and she was basking in the imagined victory of it. To her, the arrival of the police meant one thing: validation, confirmation that her instincts had been right. Sharon, however, knew better. 2 officers emerged from the vehicles. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly pressed uniform and a presence that exuded authority. His partner, shorter but equally built, scanned the area with the practiced sharpness of someone who had seen too much. They assessed the scene quickly. 2 women standing near a pool. No visible threat. No signs of an actual disturbance. The woman wasted no time in making her case. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called out, striding toward them with an air of righteous indignation. She turned and gestured toward Sharon, like she was pointing out an intruder in her backyard. This woman was attempting to close the pool, acting like she owns the place. I told her to leave, but she refused. Sharon exhaled through her nose. "Here we go." The lead officer turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, do you live here?" Sharon met his gaze evenly. "No, I own this property." Before the officer could respond, the woman scoffed loudly. "No, she does not." The officer glanced between them before focusing back on Sharon. "Do you have any identification or proof of ownership?" Sharon nodded and calmly reached into her pocket. She had been in enough of these situations to know better than to make sudden movements. She retrieved her wallet, pulled out her driver's license, and handed it to the officer. "I also have the property documents inside," she added. "If you'd like, I can grab them." The officer took the ID and studied it for a moment before glancing at the woman. "Ma'am, what's your relation to this property?" The woman faltered for the first time. I live nearby. I've seen the owner before, and I know this isn't her." Sharon tilted her head, barely suppressing her smirk. "Really? You've seen the owner?" The woman hesitated, as if realizing her mistake. "I mean, I know what kind of people live here, and I know that she doesn't." The words hung in the air, thick and revealing. The officers exchanged a glance. The lead officer's grip on Sharon's ID tightened slightly before he looked at it again, his brow furrowing. Then, suddenly, something in his demeanor shifted. He looked back up at Sharon, his eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "Wait a minute," he muttered, staring at her ID again. His partner leaned over to peek, then raised an eyebrow. "Sharon Matthews." The first officer's posture relaxed slightly, his lips parting in realization. "I know you." The woman stiffened. "What?" Sharon arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" The officer nodded, handing back her ID. "Yeah, you were on the news a few years back. Didn't you run that community outreach program in Oakland?" Sharon tilted her head, amusement creeping into her tone. "Depends. Which one?" The officer chuckled. "The one with the scholarship fund. My cousin's kid got a grant through that program." A small smile played at the corner of Sharon's lips. Small world. The woman's mouth opened and closed, her confidence cracking just a little. But the officer wasn't done. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "And you said she was trespassing." The woman faltered. "I had thought she was." The officer's voice remained calm but firm. "Did you ask her any questions before calling us?" The woman swallowed hard. I just. But now it was clear. The situation had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. The reality of her mistake was settling in, pressing down on her shoulders. The second officer, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Ma'am, did she at any point threaten you?" The woman hesitated. "No, but..." "Did she refuse to leave your property?" Another pause. "Well, no, but..." "Then why exactly did you feel the need to call the police?" The woman's face burned red. I thought I was helping. If she wasn't supposed to be here, then..." Sharon let out a humorless chuckle. "You were so sure I wasn't supposed to be here that you had no problem calling the cops on me." The lead officer sighed, glancing at his partner before shaking his head. "This isn't a police matter. Miss Matthews owns this property. There was no crime, no trespassing, nothing for us to investigate." The woman swallowed hard. I see that now." Sharon narrowed her eyes. "Do you?" The woman looked like she wanted to say something else, but no words came. The realization of what she had done, how wrong she had been, was finally settling in. The first officer turned back to Sharon. "Miss Matthews, I apologize for the inconvenience." Sharon exhaled slowly, nodding. "I appreciate that." He hesitated before adding, "And for what it's worth, your work really made a difference for a lot of people. I'm sorry you had to deal with this tonight." The woman's head snapped toward him. "Wait, so she's the Sharon Matthews?" The second officer let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yep." Sharon studied the woman's face as the realization hit. Whatever she had assumed about her, that she was some stranger sneaking around an upscale property, that she couldn't possibly own something this beautiful, this successful, had just been shattered. But the damage was already done. And now it was her turn to sit with the consequences. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The guests at the estate were still watching from their balconies, whispering. A couple near the pool had pulled out their phones, possibly recording. The woman had made a spectacle, and now she was the center of it. Sharon sighed, shaking her head. "You came here with so much certainty, and now you can't even look me in the eye." The woman glanced toward the patrol cars, as if looking for an escape, but there was none. Sharon turned to the officers. "Are we done here?" The first officer nodded. "Unless you want to file a complaint." Sharon studied the woman for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. No, she already embarrassed herself enough tonight. The woman flinched. Sharon turned and walked toward her estate, but before she stepped inside, she called over her shoulder, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Next time, think before you pick up the phone." And with that, the night was over. The unraveling of certainty. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had just happened. The patrol cars remained parked at the entrance of the estate, their flashing lights slowly dimming as the officers prepared to leave. But the confrontation wasn't over, not for Sharon, not for the woman who had called the police on her, and not for the small audience that had gathered, watching from their balconies and patios, their murmurs a quiet undercurrent in the night. Sharon took a deep breath, feeling the last threads of her patience fray. The woman, still standing stiffly by the pool gate, had gone silent. She wasn't smirking anymore. Her face, which had once been full of self-assurance and righteous indignation, was now a mix of embarrassment and something that looked like regret. But Sharon wasn't sure if it was regret for what she had done or regret for the fact that she had been wrong. "Wait," the woman blurted suddenly as Sharon turned toward the entrance of her estate. Sharon paused, but she didn't turn around just yet. She had given this woman more of her time than she deserved, and she wasn't sure she wanted to give her any more. "I made a mistake," the woman admitted, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain. Sharon finally turned, arms crossed. "You did." The woman hesitated, shifting on her feet. The silence between them stretched until she finally blurted, "I just thought." But she cut herself off before finishing the sentence. Sharon narrowed her eyes. "You just thought what?" The woman fidgeted. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Sharon let out a short, humorless laugh. "Didn't realize what?" "That I was the owner. That I belonged here." The woman swallowed. "I didn't mean." "Didn't mean to what?" Sharon's voice was sharp now. "Didn't mean to call the cops on me. Didn't mean to assume I was trespassing. Didn't mean to put me in a situation that could have gone very differently if I hadn't handled it the way I did." The woman flinched. Sharon took a slow step forward, keeping her tone even. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You saw me, and instead of asking one simple question, instead of considering that I might actually belong here, you decided I was a threat. Why? Because I don't look like the kind of person you expect to see in a place like this." The woman's face twisted in discomfort. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, as if struggling to find the right words that might somehow excuse what she had done. But there weren't any. The officers stood nearby, watching the exchange, but they didn't interfere. They had already done their job. This wasn't a police matter anymore. This was a reckoning. Finally, the woman exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood," she muttered. Sharon's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Protected from what?" "From me." The woman had no answer. A murmur ran through the small crowd of guests who had been watching. A few of them exchanged glances, shaking their heads. Some whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from disapproval to disbelief. One of them, a middle-aged man standing near his villa, called out, "Lady, you should go home. You made a fool of yourself tonight." The woman turned sharply, as if about to protest, but the reality of the situation finally seemed to hit her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment, it looked like she might still try to argue her case. But there was nothing left to argue. Sharon sighed, shaking her head. "You know what? I'm tired." The woman blinked, taken aback. "I'm tired of people like you deciding where I do and don't belong," Sharon continued. "I'm tired of having to justify my existence in spaces I worked my ass off to build. You don't need to apologize to me. You need to ask yourself why you did this in the first place. And if you can't answer that honestly, then nothing you say matters." The woman swallowed hard, but she said nothing. Sharon took a step back, looking at the officers. "Are we done here?" The lead officer nodded. "Yes, Mom." "Good," Sharon said, before turning her back on the woman and walking toward the entrance of her estate. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The aftermath. By the time Sharon entered her home, she felt the weight of the night settle onto her shoulders. She had held it together. She always did, but that didn't mean it hadn't affected her. She poured herself a glass of water, her hand steady despite the anger still humming beneath her skin. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It probably wouldn't be the last. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and saw a message from her assistant, Lena. Lena, everything okay? Heard some guests talking about police at the estate. Sharon sighed and typed a response. Sharon, just a little neighborhood drama. Nothing I couldn't handle. She hesitated, then added, let's talk about adding a Know Your Owner section to the welcome packets. Lena's reply was almost instant. Lena, say less. Sharon chuckled softly, shaking her head. If nothing else, she would make sure this never happened again. Not to her, and not to anyone else who came after her. She stepped outside onto her private balcony, looking down at the pool. The water was still now, calm, undisturbed, reflecting the soft glow of the estate's lights. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The frustration, the exhaustion, the anger, but she wouldn't let it consume her. Because at the end of the day, she still owned this place. And no one, not a neighbor, not the police, not the whispers of doubtful onlookers, could take that away from her. The ripple effect. The next morning, Sharon awoke to a different kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful stillness she had cultivated over the years in her luxury estate. It was the quiet before something bigger, a shift, a reckoning. She had barely sat down with her morning coffee when her phone buzzed again. Lena, you're trending. Sharon frowned, staring at the message for a second before clicking the link Lena had sent. It was a video, shaky, clearly recorded from one of the guests' balconies, but the footage was clear enough. The confrontation, the woman's condescending voice, the moment she called the police, the arrival of the officers, and the most damning part, when the officer recognized Sharon and confirmed that she was, in fact, the owner. The caption beneath the video read, "She called the cops on the owner of the estate. You can't make this up." Sharon groaned, rubbing her temple. The video had already racked up thousands of views, and the comments were coming in fast. Some were outrage. Another day, another black person being questioned for existing in their own space. Some. She really called the cops like she was about to be the hero. Now she just looks foolish. The way she was so certain she was right. Yikes. Others were defensive. Why does everything have to be about race? Maybe she just made a mistake. If I saw someone I didn't recognize at a luxury property, I'd be suspicious too. This is blown way out of proportion. People make assumptions all the time. And then there were those who saw the deeper issue. The problem isn't just the assumption, it's the power behind it. This woman called the police on someone who wasn't doing anything wrong. Do you know how dangerous that could have been? The fact that she didn't even consider she might be wrong before making that call says everything. This is what privilege looks like. It's not just wealth. It's the confidence that you'll be believed, no matter what. Sharon set her phone down with a sigh. She had been through enough media waves in the past to know how these things played out. People would argue, debate, dissect every detail of the video, and by next week, they'd move on to the next outrage. But this wasn't just a viral moment for her. This was her life. She had spent years building this place, making sure that her guests had a sanctuary, a place of peace, luxury, and belonging. And yet, a single person's assumptions had momentarily unraveled that. And the worst part, this wasn't new. The power of a call. Sharon wasn't naive about how these situations could have gone differently. She knew the statistics. She knew the stories. A police call like this, one based on assumption and bias, could have escalated in ways she didn't even want to think about. What if the officers had been more aggressive? What if they had approached her with their hands on their weapons, demanding she prove her innocence instead of asking questions? What if she had reacted with the frustration she had every right to feel? She had read enough headlines. Black homeowner arrested while moving into his own house. Police called on black CEO sitting in a luxury hotel lounge. Woman calls 911 on black man for looking suspicious in his own neighborhood. She had lived it. It was always the same story, just with different names and different locations. And what unsettled her most wasn't just what had happened, it was what could have happened. She thought of the other black business owners she knew, the ones who had been questioned in their own shops, their own restaurants, their own galleries, the ones who had been dismissed, disrespected, disregarded. She thought of the young girl who might be watching that viral video, wondering if she would ever be allowed to own something without people questioning if she truly belonged. And suddenly, the exhaustion hit her all over again. A knock at the door. A soft knock pulled Sharon from her thoughts. She set down her coffee and crossed the room, opening the door to find Lena standing there, a concerned look on her face. Lena, her right-hand woman, the one who kept the estate running when Sharon wasn't around. A no-nonsense powerhouse who didn't tolerate foolishness, but also had a heart bigger than the entire property. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "So," Lena said, crossing her arms, "how are we handling this?" Sharon exhaled, running a hand through her curls. "We're not. The video says enough. People can take from it what they want." Lena raised an eyebrow. "You sure? A few reporters already reached out, asking if you want to make a statement." "Nope. Even the Post is interested." Sharon hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then shook her head. "I don't need to explain myself to anybody. What happened, happened. People will talk, but I'm not going to make my life a public debate." Lena studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right," she said. "But if you change your mind, I have a PR firm on standby." Sharon smirked. "Of course you do." Lena shrugged. "What can I say? I know how these things go." She sat down on the couch, glancing out the window toward the pool. "You know she came back, right?" Sharon's brows furrowed. "Who?" "The lady from last night." Sharon's expression hardened. "Why?" "I don't know. She lingered near the entrance for a while, like she wanted to talk to you. But she left before I could ask." Sharon let out a slow breath. "Good. You think she'll try again?" Sharon considered it. Maybe. Maybe the woman had woken up this morning and realized just how badly she had embarrassed herself. Maybe she wanted to apologize. Maybe she wanted to make excuses. Or maybe she was just hoping that, by some miracle, she could erase what had happened. But the thing about assumptions, the kind of assumptions that led people to pick up the phone and call the police without hesitation, was that they had consequences. And sometimes, those consequences couldn't be undone. Sharon looked back out at her estate. Her estate. No matter what people assumed, no matter how many times she had to prove it, she had built this. She belonged here. And no one, not a neighbor, not a police officer, not an entire world of doubters, could take that away from her. The apology that never came. The morning sun stretched lazily across the estate grounds, bathing the pool in golden light. Sharon stood by the large bay window of her living room, arms crossed, watching the water ripple as a light breeze skimmed across the surface. Despite everything that had happened the night before, the estate was peaceful again. The guests were moving about as usual, some enjoying breakfast on their balconies, others taking morning strolls along the meticulously kept garden paths. To them, it was just another day in paradise. But for Sharon, the weight of last night's encounter still lingered. She took a deep breath and turned away from the window, refusing to let the memory of that woman's arrogance steal another moment of her peace. Then, a knock at the door. Lena had already mentioned that the woman from last night had returned earlier, lingering near the entrance before disappearing. Sharon wasn't sure if she wanted to deal with her, but something told her she wouldn't leave without at least trying. Sharon opened the door. And there she was, the woman from the night before. She stood stiffly on the doorstep, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a child about to receive a scolding. She wasn't smug anymore, nor was she brimming with false confidence. Her gaze flickered over Sharon, hesitant and awkward. Sharon didn't say anything. She merely raised an eyebrow, waiting. The woman cleared her throat. shifting uncomfortably under Sharon's unreadable gaze. I wanted to. She started, her voice unsteady. Sharon tilted her head. You wanted to what? The woman swallowed. I just wanted to say that. Last night, She trailed off. The words, whatever they were, seemed too difficult to push out. Sharon folded her arms, nodding slowly. Right. Go on. A brief flash of frustration crossed the woman's face, but it was gone just as quickly. Look, she said, her voice taking on a firmer tone, as if she had decided halfway through that she wasn't going to completely humble herself. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Sharon's lips twitched into a humorless smirk. Is that what you think happened? The woman huffed, glancing away for a second before looking back. I misread the situation, okay? No, Sharon corrected. You didn't misread anything. You made a choice. The woman blinked, caught off guard. Sharon took a slow step forward. You saw me closing a pool at my own property, and instead of asking a single question, you assumed I didn't belong. And then you called the police. The woman's jaw tightened. I thought I was doing the right thing. Sharon let out a short laugh, shaking her head. No, you thought you had the right to police a space that wasn't yours. And when I told you I owned it, you still didn't believe me. The woman shifted on her feet. I just didn't recognize you, she muttered weakly. Sharon exhaled sharply, staring at her. Do you recognize every single person who stays in this neighborhood? Do you question every person who steps onto this property? Or just the ones who look like me? The woman opened her mouth, but no words came. There it was. The truth she didn't want to face. Sharon watched her struggle, saw the slight twitch in her fingers, the way her lips pressed together, the way her body tensed as though fighting the urge to defend herself. But there was no defense. Finally, the woman exhaled, lowering her gaze. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Sharon tilted her head. And yet it did. The woman swallowed again. I don't know what else you want me to say. Sharon sighed, stepping back and gripping the doorframe. You don't need to say anything. You need to think about why you did it, why your first instinct was to assume that I didn't belong. The woman stared at her, searching for something, perhaps a way to explain herself that wouldn't make her look as bad as she felt. But there wasn't one. Finally, after a long silence, she muttered, I should go. Sharon nodded once. Yes, you should. The woman hesitated, but there was nothing left to say. She turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying the weight of her mistake. Sharon didn't watch her go. She simply stepped back inside and closed the door. And just like that, the confrontation was over. But the ripple effects, those would last much longer. A change in the air. That afternoon, as Sharon walked the estate grounds, she noticed the difference. The guests who had witnessed the confrontation now looked at her with something else in their eyes, not just admiration, but respect. A few of them gave her nods as she passed. Some stopped to greet her, their voices a little more careful, a little more aware. She wasn't sure if they were treating her differently out of guilt, embarrassment, or genuine reflection. Maybe a mix of all three. By evening, she saw one of the guests speaking to another, gesturing toward the pool, shaking their head as if retelling the story. Word was spreading. Not just about the viral video, but about the reality behind it. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about what that woman had believed before she had even opened her mouth. And maybe, just maybe, some of these people were thinking twice now. Maybe the next time they saw a black woman in a position of power, they wouldn't immediately question it. Maybe the next time they saw someone who didn't fit their narrow idea of belonging, they'd take a second to consider their assumptions before acting on them. Sharon didn't need an apology. She needed people to be better. And as she stood at the edge of the pool, looking at the water's smooth, undisturbed surface, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe this was a start. Beyond the surface, the sun had begun its descent behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the estate. Sharon walked the perimeter of the pool, her mind racing despite the calmness of the evening. The events of the last 24 hours had shaken her, not because she was unfamiliar with the experience, but because it had unfolded so publicly, with a level of scrutiny that she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a story now, one that people were dissecting, debating, and drawing their own conclusions about. Her phone had been ringing all day. Reporters, acquaintances, even old business partners she hadn't heard from in years. The messages ranged from support to questions about whether she would take legal action. She wasn't interested in legal battles, at least not right now. She was more concerned about the conversations that were happening in the wake of the viral video. The way people had reacted told her everything she needed to know. Some understood immediately. Some refused to see the problem. Some, like that woman, had been so confident in their right to question her presence that they didn't realize how deeply ingrained their assumptions were. Sharon sighed and made her way back toward the villa, her heels clicking softly against the stone pathway. As she approached the main entrance, she noticed a small group of guests chatting near the lounge chairs. A few of them looked at her, their expressions hesitant, as if debating whether or not to approach her. One finally did. A man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive linen shirt and slacks, stepped forward. His wife stood beside him, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass. "Miss Matthews," the man started, offering a polite nod. "I just wanted to say, we saw what happened last night. We didn't realize who you were at first." Sharon raised an eyebrow. "Who I was?" The man cleared his throat. "I mean, we didn't know you were the owner. Not that it should matter, of course." Sharon tilted her head slightly, studying him. "But it did, didn't it?" He blinked. His wife shifted uncomfortably. He hesitated. "I guess I never thought about it that way before." Sharon gave him a knowing smile. "That's the problem, isn't it?" He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, it is." His wife finally spoke. "It just makes you think about all the little things we don't even notice, the assumptions we make without even realizing it." Sharon nodded. "That's how it works. That's how it always works." The man looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he just nodded again. "Well, I just wanted to say that I respect what you've built here. You have a beautiful estate, and I'm sorry for what happened." Sharon studied them for a moment before finally responding. "I appreciate that, but don't just be sorry. Be aware." The man seemed to take that in. He nodded once more before turning back toward his wife. They walked off, murmuring quietly to each other, leaving Sharon standing there, alone with her thoughts. This was what real change looked like. Not grand gestures, not performative apologies, just moments of clarity, moments of self-awareness that chipped away at something bigger than one single incident. The neighbors' reactions. That evening, Sharon received a visitor she hadn't expected. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Michael Abrams, one of the more well-known residents of the gated community. He was in his 60s, a retired attorney who had made a name for himself in corporate law before settling into a life of leisure. He offered a small smile. "Miss Matthews, may I have a moment?" Sharon stepped aside, allowing him in. Michael glanced around the estate before settling his gaze on her. "I wanted to apologize for what happened last night." Sharon folded her arms. "You weren't the one who called the cops." "No," Michael agreed, "but I saw it happen, and I didn't step in. I didn't say anything." Sharon studied him. "And why is that?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Because it's easier to stay quiet. It's easier to assume that things will sort themselves out, even when you know better." She nodded slowly. "You did know better, didn't you?" Michael exhaled. "I did, and that's what bothers me. I've lived in this community for years. I've seen these patterns before, and I didn't do a damn thing to stop them." Sharon sat down on the edge of her couch, motioning for him to take a seat as well. "What do you want me to say, Michael?" "I don't expect anything," he admitted. "I just wanted to acknowledge it. To acknowledge that people like me, people who look like me, are part of the problem when we choose to stay silent." Sharon watched him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but he looked genuinely unsettled. Finally, she said, "Then do something about it." Michael nodded slowly. "I will." She didn't know if she fully believed him, but if nothing else, at least he was beginning to understand the role he had played in it all. That was something. The woman's last attempt. Later that night, just as Sharon was about to close up, she saw her again. The woman. She was standing outside the estate, near the gated entrance, looking hesitant, almost nervous. Sharon could have ignored her. She could have walked away, locked the door, and moved on. But instead, she walked over to the gate and unlocked it, stepping outside. The woman's eyes darted to her, and she opened her mouth to speak. But before she could, Sharon held up a hand. "If you came here for redemption, you won't find it with me," she said calmly. The woman flinched but didn't look away. "I just wanted to." "No," Sharon cut her off. "You wanted to feel better. You wanted me to take this weight off your shoulders. But I won't. That's something you'll have to carry yourself." The woman's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Sharon thought she might argue. But then, something shifted. She nodded, almost to herself. "I suppose I deserve that," she admitted. Sharon exhaled. "Yes, you do." The woman hesitated. "I hope that one day you'll—" "No," Sharon interrupted. "This isn't about me. It never was. And I don't owe you anything." The woman bit her lip, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She nodded once, then turned and walked away. Sharon watched her go, waiting until she disappeared down the street before turning back toward her estate. She had reclaimed her space. Not just the physical space, but the space that had almost been stolen from her, the right to exist here without question. And she would never let anyone take that from her again. Reclaiming the narrative. The next morning, Sharon awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The estate was peaceful, as it always was at sunrise, with the soft lapping of the lake against the shore and the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Yet, despite the tranquility, there was an underlying tension in the air. The viral video hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only gained more traction overnight. She hadn't planned on addressing it publicly. She had told Lena as much. But as she sipped her morning coffee and scrolled through the flood of messages on her phone, something inside her shifted. She had spent years working to create this estate, a sanctuary where people could come and experience beauty, comfort, and peace. And yet, one woman's ignorant actions had nearly rewritten her story in a matter of minutes. No, she wasn't going to let that happen. The decision to speak. By mid-morning, Sharon had made up her mind. She set up her phone on the small marble table outside her villa, the pool shimmering in the background. Taking a deep breath, she hit record. "I wasn't going to say anything about this," she started, her voice steady. "Because honestly, I'm exhausted. But after seeing the conversations happening around this situation, I realized that silence isn't an option." She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sharon Matthews, and I own this estate. I built it from the ground up. I fought for the permits. I designed every detail. I worked through setbacks, financial struggles, and endless red tape to make this place a reality." She took a slow breath before continuing. "But last night, a woman saw me closing my own pool and assumed I didn't belong. Instead of asking the simple question, instead of considering the possibility that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, she called the police on me." Her expression hardened. "And let's be clear, this wasn't about concern for the property. This was about control. About the assumption that someone like me couldn't possibly own something like this. That my very presence was enough to justify dialing 911. She let those words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I want you to think about how quickly she made that decision. Think about how confident she was in her assumption. Think about the privilege it takes to be so sure that the world will back you up, even when you're wrong. She sighed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I've seen the comments. Some of you are defending her. Some of you are saying this isn't about race. That she was just trying to be careful. That she didn't mean any harm. A sharp, humorless chuckle escaped her lips. And that's the thing about harm. It doesn't require intent. Harm is harm, whether or not you meant it. She leaned back, staring directly into the camera. This isn't just my story. This is something Black homeowners, Black business owners, and Black professionals face every day. Being questioned, being doubted, being forced to prove we belong in spaces we've earned. And frankly, we're tired of it. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. So no, I don't need an apology from her. What I need is for people like her to start questioning their own biases before they put people like me in danger. She let that final sentence settle before reaching out and stopping the recording. The moment the video finished uploading, her phone started vibrating with notifications. The internet reacts. Within an hour, the video had thousands of views. By noon, it had crossed the 500,000 mark. Her words were spreading. Some people still tried to defend the woman, but others weren't having it. She called the police like she was ordering takeout. No hesitation. No concern about the consequences. Sharon didn't just own the estate. She owned this conversation. This is why Black success doesn't protect us from discrimination. No matter how much we accomplish, we still get treated like we don't belong. She even saw other Black business owners jumping into the conversation, sharing their own experiences. Restaurant owners who had been mistaken for staff. Doctors who had been questioned about whether they were really the physician in charge. This was bigger than her, an unexpected visitor. That evening, just as the estate was settling into its usual quiet, Lena knocked on her door. "You have a visitor," she said, looking mildly amused. Sharon frowned. "Who?" Lena smirked. "The lady from last night." Sharon's stomach twisted slightly, but she kept her face neutral. "She's waiting outside. Looks nervous as hell." Sharon sighed. She had already said everything she needed to say. She had made it clear that she wasn't looking for apologies or explanations. But something told her she needed to hear this. So she stepped outside. The woman was standing near the entrance, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked like she had aged overnight, like the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. When she saw Sharon, she swallowed hard. "I saw your video," she said quietly. Sharon raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. The woman hesitated, then continued. "I've been thinking about what you said. About why I did what I did." She looked away for a moment before meeting Sharon's gaze again. "You were right. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even consider that I could be wrong." Sharon remained silent, waiting. The woman exhaled. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to tell you that I see it now. I see what I did." Sharon studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Then what are you going to do about it?" The woman blinked. "What? What are you going to do about it?" Sharon repeated. "Because I don't need your apology. I need you to take what you've learned and do something with it. I need you to have this conversation with your friends, your family, the people who think just like you." The woman nodded slowly, the realization dawning on her. "I will," she whispered. "I swear I will." Sharon didn't respond. She simply gave her a small nod, then turned and walked back toward her estate. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because for the first time, the weight of the night before wasn't pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't her burden to carry anymore. She had reclaimed her narrative. And now, it was up to the world to listen.